Okay, good morning everyone. We're back with the Kohler Courage XT7 and we're going to pick up on the next series of disassembly steps, which we start at page 8.8. Disassembly, disconnect flywheel brake spring. Now I've already taken the brake spring off, so we're going to skip that step. But the flywheel, actually this flywheel doesn't even have a brake, but most of them I had taken the springs off. All right, well, let's move on to the flywheel. Very important, very key part of the engine. Using a flywheel strap wrench to hold the flywheel in place, remove the hex nut inside the drive cup. Now, they certainly could do it that way, and we've done it that way in the past, and it's a very effective way to use a strap wrench to hold the flywheel still as you take the drive cut nut off. Today, for the sake of time, I'm going to use an impact wrench. So this is a 3/4. And that goes a lot faster. So we'll take the drive cup off. Now, when we're doing ID, when you all have been doing ID, some of you had trouble with the drive cup. You know, you'd email me, Dodson, I can't find the purpose, the function of the drive cup. The drive cup is attached onto the top of the flywheel, and it gives the recoil starter something to grab onto. So remember, when you pull that recoil, you'll see those two wings pop out, here and here. And when they pop out, they grab onto these edges of the drive cup, and that's what turns the whole system over. And it's basically an extension of the flywheel up into the recoil. Okay, so take the drive cup off. Underneath the drive cup is a flywheel fan. A couple weeks ago, I was talking to you about the blower housing and how this engine is strictly air cooled. It doesn't have a radiator. There's no water cooled system. The only way this engine cools itself off is via air. Do you think this engine creates a lot of heat? Absolutely. It creates an immense amount of heat. So it's constantly cooling itself off while heating itself up, and that's done primarily through this fan. Now you also notice on the cylinder head, you have this kind of a layered look, right? These little fins. Those fins are designed to increase surface area. And when you increase surface area and you allow cold air to hit those areas, the rate of cooling is increased dramatically. So this isn't just random that you have these fins on the cylinder head. That's very much on purpose to increase surface area and maximize cooling. So we're going to take the fan off. And underneath that, you have our flywheel. Now the flywheel does several things. Last week we saw that it houses the magnet for the ignition armature. That's one purpose. The flywheel also is heavy, and it creates momentum. As it spins, it creates momentum, and that momentum helps bring the piston back up into the cylinder. So once that power stroke, that explosion happens, that fuel and air mixture is ignited by the spark plug, it forces that piston down. And in this engine, I should say it forces it sideways. It's got to have some momentum to bring it back up into the cylinder. That's what the flywheel, it stores up energy and keeps the whole system really based around the crankshaft spinning. So we're going to take the flywheel off today. Using okay, we did that. Number 2, remove the drive cup and lift off the fan, noting orientation on the flywheel for reassembly. Good. Number 3, the flywheel is mounted on a tapered shaft. That shaft's called a crankshaft. To remove it, use a rubber mallet to land a firm blow slightly off center on the flywheel. So we're going to try that today, and you can see the figure. Honestly, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So we have a backup plan if it doesn't today. So I'm going to take my rubber mallet, and as the manual described, I'm going to strike a blow just off center of the center, and you can see it's still pretty tight. All right, it works good. So we got our flywheel off. This flywheel is made of cast iron, and it's heavy, it's dense, it's heavy, which this engine actually isn't a Courage XT7, but a newer model of some of the other engines I have in the shop. And it's interesting because the old flywheels that they were using were cast aluminum. And for some reason, they've gone to a cast iron flywheel, which I think is better. It's heavier and it's more durable. So I'm glad to see that they've made that change. Some of you might be noticing all the rust around the edge of the flywheel and thinking, oh, that might impede the induction of electricity. It will a little bit, but if you're ever doing some troubleshooting, it's not going to completely stop the electric magnetic field that's created. Even if you have a good layer of rust, you still should have a little bit of electricity. If you don't, then it's something else going on. Now, could you take a wire brush or some steel and clean that up? Absolutely, and that wouldn't hurt anything. But it's not going to be a main cause of engine malfunction in an electrical system. Okay, so we've got the flywheel off. Next, we're going to remove the breather assembly. Now, I'm not actually going to remove the breather assembly, but I will show you what it looks like. So if you remember, we took off the breather tube, which is attached here, and then it went over to your air cleaner base. And you can see here in a moment where it goes on the other side. So it's kind of like a check valve, if you remember from plumbing. So it's got this screen which acts as a filter, and then if the air pressure is excessive inside the crankcase down in the engine, it'll take this little plastic disc that's being held down by that screen, and it'll force it up. That spring only has so much tension. It can only hold the disc down for so long. If there's excess pressure inside the crankcase, it'll force that up, and it'll force the air out of the engine. So it's just to help protect from excessive pressure inside the engine. For the sake of today, we're going to leave that part on. So I'll just hand tight that back on, because we really don't need to take that off. That's not a necessity. One thing I want to note before I forget, you can see this is the end of the crankshaft, the main spinning part of the engine, and you notice that it is tapered, which means it's not flush. It'll come at itself taper, and that's where the flywheel is mounted. You also know this part right here. And strangely enough, if someone was to ask me, Dodson, what is the most important part on an engine like this, a small engine? The most important part. Would it be the carburetor? No, probably not. Would it be the piston? No, I mean, that's pretty important, obviously, but not the most important part. The most important part, and if you didn't have the part, or if it was broken, the engine would not work properly, would be this little tiny part right here. Just that little chunk of metal, most important part of this engine, and that's called the flywheel key. That key fits into that channel, and it makes sure that the crankshaft and the flywheel spin at the same rate. If that key wasn't there, you could take the recoil and you could spin that flywheel using the cup, of course, and it could spin on the crankshaft, and the crankshaft could stay stationary. You want to have those two spin at the exact same rate, and that controls so much on that engine. It controls timing of the valves. It controls timing of the ignition. You know, when that ignition armature creates electricity and sends it to the spark plug. That's a very, very important part. It also is a part that can fail. This key is actually designed to break. Yeah, that's right. It's designed to break. It's designed to shear. And it does. They will. They'll shear. For example, you're out mowing the lawn, you hit a rock. When that blade hits that rock, the blade slows down, or it might even stop for a split second. Well, the engine can't accommodate for that slowdown or that stop, so the crankshaft keeps spinning. The shear of the flywheel happens, you've protected the engine, protected itself by shearing this flywheel key. Not the end of the world. You take the flywheel off, you put a new key in there, they're very inexpensive, and you're back in operation. Flywheel key, very important. Okay. Let's see, we took off the breather assembly. Okay, we're gonna remove the spark plug. Remove the spark plug from the cylinder head. We're gonna use a spark plug socket. I don't know if you can see in there, but this socket has a little rubber tube. This is a spark plug socket, and that rubber tube helps protect the spark plug exterior, which is made of porcelain, which is an insulator. It prevents it from breaking. So you want to make sure you use a specialty spark plug socket when you're taking off a spark plug. So you take that rubber tube, put it over the porcelain, grab onto the spark plug, once you get it loose, if you would like, you can do the rest by hand. Okay, there's a spark plug. It's brand new. Look at how clean it is. So what happens here, I don't know if you guys can see or not, but electricity comes shooting through here and comes up through this piece right here, which is the electrode, and you've got this tiny little gap, and electricity doesn't like to flow through air. Air is not really a conductor of electricity, but it will, and we see that, right? We've seen lightning. Electricity will flow through air, but it doesn't like to. You've got to have a lot of electrical pressure to force it through air. So that's what we're doing here. We're using voltage to force electrons to jump air, to jump the gap. And then obviously it comes back, because that's how electricity flows. It flows in a complete loop. So, and at that part where it jumps the gap, there's heat. And that heat is what ignites the fuel and the air mixture. So that's a spark plug. Okay, so we took the spark plug off, remove the flywheel brake assembly. We already talked about that. We don't really have a brake assembly on this newer model. Okay, we're going to remove the valve cover. Remove 4 hex flange screws from the valve cover. Remove the cover and the cover gasket. So again, I already pre-loosened these, so I'm just going to take them out by hand just to save time today. Make sure we're efficient. So there's the valve cover and the valve cover gasket. One note too, when you take off the valve cover gasket, don't be alarmed at all if a little oil drips out of there. That's pretty common. You know, that's okay. So you might see a little oil dripping out of there. Just clean it up. That's not a problem at all. Okay, now that my cover's off, you can see what's sometimes called a valve train. We've got our rocker arms and our rocker studs, jam nuts, rocker guide pivots or rocker guides. I don't know if you can see, but back in there we've got our valve springs. So this is what's controlling the opening and closing of the valves in the engine. Remember, the engine's got to intake air and exhaust air. Air in, air out. Over and over again. And the valves are what do that. So we're going to take that assembly apart today. So took the valve cover off, removed the jam nuts and pivots. Use a socket and a wrench to remove the jam nuts and the rocker arm pivots from the rocker studs. So I'm going to grab onto the rocker guides here, and then as the manual implied, I'm going to use a socket and ratchet. Now I've pre-loosened these. They're going to be tight. So take the jam nut off, and then that allows you to take the rocker guide off. There's the rocker guide. Now the jam nut, as the name implies, is designed to be tightened against the rocker guide to keep it still, because there's a lot of movement in here, and over time that movement could cause this guide to loosen, and if it does, then it changes how much the valves open. And so this jam nut is literally jammed, tightened against the guide to keep it still. So this is a very important part too. So we'll take this other set off. Again, not in every case, but for every piston the engine has, you have 2 valves. Again, that's not always the case. Sometimes you have, sometimes